think if it's okay, we're going to hold questions for the time being, and then we'll do the panel and get everybody back together. So next up is Matt Woodstock joining us from Morgan State University, and he is actually soon to start a postdoc scholarship here at WHOI in the next month and a half or so. And he has a history of working on organismal functional roles in aquatic ecosystems, and more recently, ecosystem modeling, specifically in the deep sea and the mesopelagic. So thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm Matt Woodstock, and today I'm mostly going to discuss how we can leverage data, in particularly food web data, for holistic purposes. And then I'm going to use a lot of my dissertation work, which was in the Gulf of Mexico, as examples, and then lead into some thoughts about how I feel that we can improve on those efforts. So a lot of people to thank. Modeling is not done in a vacuum. So particularly the Deep End team, and then my PhD advisor, Yuying Zhang. And when I'm talking about food web modeling, I'm mostly talking about the intersection between population dynamics, energetics, and trophic ecology. So the basic concept is that there's several factors that can be influencing the energy flows into and out of a particular population. And a lot of these, like predation pressure, fishing pressure, and consumption rates, are dependent on other species in the system or human involvement. And we typically quantify all of these as rates, which I would classify as some sort of calculation of a process over a unit time. And this allows us to have a standardized value that we can then compare among species or within populations over time. And once we understand these rates and how dynamic they are, we can then forecast those populations over time. And this is the general theory behind a lot of our single species assessment efforts. But a problem that we have with a lot of those efforts in any marine ecosystem, whether it's in the open ocean or not, is that food webs are very complex. A particular population can be influenced by a myriad of predator and prey populations, not to mention the competitive effects of other species. And this makes calculations of energy fluxes difficult, but necessary for us to understand holistic food web processes and to identify the particular predators that are most important for a prey population. Now, complicating this further is that ecosystems are also dynamic. And this means that when we're making those assessments, things like predation mortality, fishing mortality, and consumption rates are also dynamic. So food web modeling is largely an exercise to take all of those species in the system and simulate them all at one time. And the main advantage to this is that we can model predator-prey dynamics and the changing of those magnitudes, those effects. And we can also incorporate seasonal and interannual environmental parameters to get at questions like climate change. And that gives us a lot of flexibility when it comes to the type of research questions we can ask, whether they're for ecosystem-based management or any restoration, or for just general scientific inquiry. Now, the open ocean is obviously not immune to the effects of humans, and disturbances that are likely to affect these systems are much more likely to affect entire communities or the entire ecosystem rather than a specific species. Now, one event that we heard a lot about yesterday was the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which is kind of the impetus for a lot of my work. And to provide a little bit more detail, that wellhead in the top right was 1,500 meters deep, and there was a plume of oil that stayed around 1,100 to 1,300 meters and persisted there. So this was very much a deep water event. Now, that figure in the bottom right shows the Deepwater Horizon site, as well as all of the active oil and gas platforms and leases in the Gulf of Mexico. And you'll see that there are several leases and active platforms that are seaward of the Deepwater Horizon site, which is a little bit of a problem because you're in deeper water. It's a little bit more of an error-prone process. And there have been oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico since Deepwater Horizon, just at a little bit of a different magnitude. Now, we heard a lot about the effects of this on the food web from Tracy and Heather yesterday, in particular to the decline that we've seen. But to frame this more for my modeling work, I have a few main concepts. Now, one is the idea that zooplankton populations have largely showed to be relatively stable in the long term following the spill. So basically, there was an immediate decline for a lot of those populations, but they recovered very quickly. And over the long term, it seems that they've kind of persisted and are back at the levels that they once were pre-spill. At the same time, it was very unclear how mobile predators, like Cam talked about earlier, would have been affected. But it wasn't really believed that the impact would have been huge, particularly since these predators are mobile and since commercial fishing operations were in a moratorium immediately after the spill as a response. However, as you heard yesterday, we have seen a persistent decline in these populations. And we think this likely has to do with elevated levels of hydrocarbons in the stomachs and eggs of a lot of the mesopelagic fishes, crustaceans, and cephalopods, as this figure is showing for 2015 to 2016, and we've continued on with this analysis. So I set out to take a food web modeling approach and to estimate the ecosystem scale effects of those declines on mesopelagic micronectin populations, and what that would do to food web structure. So this is much more of the brick and mortar, develop a model, simulate something, in this case declined mesopelagic populations, and then calculate the trends in diet and food web structure. Now the second objective was to estimate additional mortality that was likely expressed on these mesopelagic micronectin populations following the spill. And this is much more of a theoretical process, but it was a method for us to estimate the effect of this disturbance in the absence of an empirical method to do so. If that was successful, my objective was to try to project those population trends out through the end of this decade into 2030. So I developed this model using the EcoPath with EcoSim software for the Northeast Gulf of Mexico, seaward of the 1,000-meter isobath, which is where we have our mesopelagic data. Now this model requires information about energetic rates, biomass standing stocks, diets, and fisheries landings to essentially try to account for all of the energy that is flowing throughout the system. So if you imagine there being a pie chart like this for each functional group in our model, and that pie is representing all of the energy that population consumes on an annual rate, all of that energy has to be allocated to a particular process. Now at the end of this, we have our typical static food web that all of our simulations can be built from. And that's when we can look at this food web diagram that a lot of people really like to see, but there's actually a lot of telling information here. For starters, trophic levels on the y-axis, and there is no x-axis. And each of these nodes is a different functional group, and the thickness of these lines is the predation impact from predator to prey. So it's not just displaying who eats whom, it reflects how much is consumed as well, and those are based on the rates that are in the model. Now, since this talk is titled Lessons Learned, I'm going to pop up some of the more important aspects as such. Now, once we have a food web, we can calculate those energy flows, various network analyses, and you can really go crazy with all of the different results that you can look at here. However, in these models, and this is true for most food web models, they are highly reliant on our trophic data and our biomass. So as Tony alluded to yesterday, we can balance energy food webs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're accurate. So we really need a lot of data feeding into these models to constrain what the potential possibilities of those energy flow webs are. Now, another advantage to having a food web is that there are general rules that a lot of ecosystems should be following. So I recently did a meta-analysis of approximately 200 different EcoPath models that are available in an online repository. Each point on this plot is a different food functional group from each of those EcoPath models, and they're colored by a different trophic level grouping. Now, the x-axis is the group's biomass, and the y-axis is energy throughput, which is the total amount of energy that a functional group is responsible for ascending up the food web in these models. And you can see that although this is from 200 different models, they're from very different systems, ranging from freshwater systems to open ocean. They were developed by different people, and they're really at a different level of robustness compared to how much data they had. There's a very strong relationship here in biomass and energy throughput, to the point where I would expect to see this in any of the models that I'm developing. Now, these kind of rules of thumb or relationships, among many others that are published in the literature, help us fill gaps when we don't have the information that we necessarily need, but we need to put in a number. And this is obviously a very common problem in the mesopelagic zone, as we've been talking about. Now, additionally, once you have a model, things like this can help be a diagnostic for, are my models actually doing what they're supposed to be doing? And essentially help us put our unknown values at least within the right ballpark when we have those gaps. Now, after that, we can then add time. So this model was simulated through 2018, which at that point was our last year of available mesopelagic data. We've since continued that time series. So EcoSim, which is the time dynamic component of EcoPath, is using foraging arena theory, which is creating nonlinear functional response curves similar to the classic Hollings type 2 and type 3 functional responses shown here. And they're different for each predator. So they can be calibrated in the model, and that actually requires time series data to be able to do that. So having time series data at different trophic levels in your system is incredibly important to developing these models, not just for EcoPath, but for others as well. Now, for our efforts, I forced the mesopelagic micronectin groups to decline to the level at which we saw in our field-derived data. And my main objective was to explore how this decline would influence individual trophic interactions. So to test this, I adapted a network analysis technique called mixed trophic impact, which quantifies the relative top-down and bottom-up impacts that each functional group has on each other, including all of your fisheries and indirect interactions. I took the model output and reconstructed diet and mortality matrices in order to do this analysis, and I did it at each time step so that I could assess whether or not there was a change in a particular trophic interaction over time throughout the simulation. And throughout the simulation, each interaction could either strengthen, weaken, or have no observable change. And overall, we saw that over 1/4 of trophic interactions actually changed when we saw a depleted mesopelagic prey field in our models. However, when one interaction strengthened, another one often weakened. So there's trade-offs that we believe are associated with prey switching. Now, the general trend is that the predators were predicted to become less reliant on the mesopelagic preys and more reliant on epipelagic preys, including juveniles of commercially important species, which obviously could create a cyclical problem when you incorporate commercial fishing into the equation. Now, one question we often get in these predictive modeling efforts is, how legit are they? Will they actually come true? And it's a fair question. So to help answer that, we have to look to other work, particularly when we're in data-limited systems without the availability to just go out and get validation data. Now, since we published that initial paper, a different ecosystem modeling effort in the Gulf of Mexico used an Atlantis model. So Atlantis is a much more complicated framework than EcoPath. It's essentially a biogeochemical model combined with a higher trophic level model. This model was spatially explicit, and it actually covered the entire Gulf of Mexico, but they asked a similar question of what would happen to the food web with a depleted mesopelagic prey field, and they found basically the same result. But notably, that this also affected areas beyond where we saw the spill as well, including on the West Florida Shelf, which is that shaded region, which is a coastal region shallower than the 200-meter isobath. And the lesson that we have here is that having multiple models in a region that are operating under different assumptions and use slightly different equations, and then having them do similar investigations can provide greater confidence in our model results. Now, obviously, field data validating these results would be best, but that is very resource intensive and may not always be a feasible thing for us to do, as we've been discussing. Now, just a few months ago, a population dynamics model for oceanic cetaceans was hot off the press, and this was for the Gulf of Mexico, looking at the populations after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And it showed that there was a decline between 1% to 8% of the population sizes of various species, and that ranged based on their dependence on deep pelagic preys. Now, our EcoPath model aggregated oceanic cetaceans into 3 different functional groups. We had baleen whales, which weren't included in this analysis, but we also had toothed whales like sperm whales and deep diving beak whales, as well as oceanic dolphins. Now, in our model, our toothed whale functional group was projected to decline at basically the same rate that they're projecting in this paper, but our oceanic dolphin functional group didn't really show a decline. And I think this has to do with the diets that we were putting on our oceanic cetaceans in our model being very epipelagic reliant. They still ate mesopelagic preys, but they weren't as reliant on mesopelagic organisms as the toothed whales in the model. So we think that's why we're seeing this kind of contrasting result. And the lesson we have here is that there's always things that we can change and improve upon in these models, and potentially areas where we have new data or where new information becomes available. So I like to say that these models are never entirely finished. Now, sure, we have to stop sometimes and we have to write manuscripts and write reports and answer research questions, but ultimately these models are a representation of our current understanding of the system and the data we have, and that is constantly changing. So our next step was to try and predict the external sources of mortality that would have been caused by the Deepwater Horizon and expressed by mesopelagic populations, and to use that to more freely forecast how these populations predicted these trends. And as I alluded to, these models are constantly in development. And this project was a couple years after that initial one, and new data had become available. I had formed new collaborations. I had also developed a carbon export model for mesopelagic fishes, which was relying on energetic rates that could have been informed into this future modeling effort. So basically, we were able to slightly adjust some of the input parameters in the initial model, again, refining what we have in our modeling framework. And in this effort, I developed several different iterations of potential mortality regimes to be expressed on our mesopelagic micronectin. These 4 types of mortality regimes included a suite of scenarios where mortality remained constant over time, so essentially acting as a control where mortality just doesn't decrease. A second suite where mortality declined in a stepwise pattern, including the possibility of reaching 0, so it's declining over time. A third where mortality declined as an exponential rate, so it never actually reaches 0, but it gets to a very small amount. And then a fourth mortality regime where mortality kind of declined at a random rate to essentially cover the fact that we don't actually know what the effect of this spill was on our mesopelagic micronectin. So I was really taking a shotgun approach to find any scenario that could produce population trends that would fit within the 95% confidence intervals of our field data for each year. And depending on which mortality shape was and is truly being expressed, we kind of have 2 different stories. One where there's the potential for population recovery by 2030, and a second where populations are really predicted to remain depressed with very little variation among all of the scenarios that fit within our data. And I'm only showing metophids here, but all of our mesopelagic groups showed a similar trend. I'll caveat this by saying that anytime we're predicting population trends, you are putting a lot of faith into the accuracy of the model itself. But as we've collected new data, we are looking into expanding this. And as you saw yesterday, we haven't really seen a recovery of these populations beyond 2011 in the samples that we've had. And although this is somewhat of a backwards approach to modeling, when we're trying to use the model to estimate the effect size of a disturbance, and it's really unknown, I think studies like this are really important because when it comes to understanding the effect of a disturbance in the mesopelagic zone, we often don't really know how that effect is going to continue in the future or how it's really being expressed right now. This is really a piece that, at least in our efforts, have kind of been very well adopted by our end user groups. Now, in addition, last year I wrote a review about ecosystem modeling in the deep sea. So this includes anything deeper than 200 meters. It includes anything that's quantifying energy fluxes from the primary producer to the higher trophic level apex predator groups. And I also had to remove any duplicates, so like dissertation chapters that were later published. Now, to supplement a Web of Science search, which is what I used for this analysis, I also looked in the references section of each of the papers that were brought up to try to supplement as much as I can and catch as much of the work as I could. And the main goal of this was really, 1, to collate all of the information that was out there, and then 2, to provide thoughts for how I felt existing efforts haven't really been explored. And this led to the accumulation of 304 total publications, the oldest being a chapter from Catherine Green's dissertation from 1975 in the Southern Ocean. There's 2 lines on this plot, and the top one with that blue gradient is just the cumulative number of studies over time. And that red one is studies that I defined as having a quote-unquote deep sea identifier. So having some instance of the deep sea, so like a mesopelagic group, or mentioning that they're focused on the deep sea in the title or the abstract of the paper. And now what this means is that the majority of models that are including deep sea ecosystems are really focused on other aspects of the ecosystem. And a lot of times you're going to have a quote-unquote mesopelagic functional group, which generally means that all of the mesopelagic animals are being treated as having the exact same life history, the exact same diets, etc. So you're aggregating that group. So you're essentially assuming that there's functional redundancy among all mesopelagic animals or myctophids, where we very well know that there are differences among these animals, and we just don't have the ability to quantify the ecosystem scale effects of those differences. Now, there's a variety of different modeling frameworks out there, but the most common is the EcoPath with EcoSim software by far, which for this talk really only serves to mean that we're often lacking in ability to take multi-model approaches, as I showed earlier, which can help us provide confidence in our model results. And finally, there's spatial disparity in a lot of our modeling efforts. with some regions with really no regions with no ecosystem models at all. So Nina Yang yesterday showed a plot of information that was available in the mesopelagic zone, and it basically would overlap pretty well with this plot where a lot of the areas that haven't really seen models are areas where we don't have a lot of data. But what this does do is leads to potential regional differences in our ability to use ecosystem models as a tool in order to advance towards ecosystem-based resource management if the need so arises. Now, aside from the obvious data limitation problems, I feel that there are several improvements that are necessary for the development to better estimate ecosystem processes in the mesopelagic zone. Now, for the mesopelagic in particular, organisms are much more finely distributed according to depths than they are horizontally on a latitude and longitudinal scale. But most modeling frameworks don't really have a way to incorporate depth at a fine enough scale to really capture diovertical effects that we know exist in a lot of these organisms, whether that be diovertical migration or just the standard this organism occupies a particular depth relative to other species in the system. Now, second is the integration of species-specific traits and their effect on energetics. So modelers often have to aggregate species into broader functional groups as a way to reduce our model complexity. But if we assume that, for example, all myctophids are the same, as I already mentioned, we're missing out on the differences in their life histories, and we can't calculate how those differences actually are influencing energy flows in our systems. Now, third is the use of multiple data types, which we've talked quite a bit about today. The biggest issue for me being trophic data. So feeding relationships in a lot of these models are really reliant on diet matrices, which are usually best configured for gut content analyses. Now, we need to think of ways to use other sources of diet data, like biochemical markers or eDNA or observational data, among all others. And then once we're able to do that, how do we best incorporate the biases in those estimates to really integrate that information to get the most accurate representation of feeding in our models? So that's more of a rhetorical question meant to lead into a lot of the breakout groups that we're going to be doing this afternoon. Now, so I mentioned that I'll be starting a postdoc here at WHOI, and my goal will really be to attack a lot of the ideas that I just mentioned. So I have a poster this evening on the topic, so I won't go into much detail. But the idea is to develop a modeling framework that works as an individual-based model, meaning that I'm modeling individuals rather than populations or communities that are aggregated, allowing for more finite size structures of populations and the integration of species-specific traits when we know them. Now, feeding will be set up in this model so that each individual is making choices relative to predator-prey size ratios and prey preference matrices, similar to an electivity matrix for the trophic ecologists in the room, or what plankton modelers will often call a palatability matrix. Essentially, this relaxes the assumption or relaxes the reliance on particular trophic types and should allow us to use multiple data types to inform predation in the model so that each predator can choose the prey that they would prefer based on distance, prey preference, and then size ratios. And once we aggregate this for all individuals of a particular population, we should be able to explore various questions like spatial temporal variability in aquatic food webs, as well as identify key species or taxa that may be most relevant for the emergence or ascension of energy up to the apex predators in your system, including your federally protected species and commercially important species currently. Now, to kind of put a bow on why I feel food web modeling is important, we've talked a lot in the Gulf of Mexico after Deepwater Horizon about the fact that, or the idea that science and the availability of resources to do science is often very reactionary. So meaning that it happens after the event. So for example, an oil rig explodes 1,500 meters deep in the Gulf of Mexico. We then get the resources to go out and fish the mesopelagic zone at a regular interval. And although this is just kind of how the world and how funding works, it presents an issue that by the time we learn about a disturbance, the effects of that disturbance are already ongoing. Now, instead, I prefer to advocate more for proactive science, where we try to gain an understanding of the potential effects of a disturbance before they happen in an ecosystem. Now, one tool to do this is food web modeling, particularly to look at those ecosystem scale effects. And there's just a lot of flexibility in using this tool to answer those questions. I hope that some of this was insightful. I want to say thank you for inviting me to speak here today. All of those that have helped in the development of these models and the collection of data to develop them, as well as all the organizations that have funded the collection of these data. And thank you all for listening.
So we have time for a few specific questions for Matt, and then we can do the panel.
Hey, that was a really cool talk. I was wondering, does EcoPath support life stage dependent groups for some of your categories? And then my other question was, how do you most often get your rates for the trophodynamic portion?
Yeah, two good questions. So the first one, the short answer is yes. When you know that there are ontogenetic shifts in diet, for example, or if the adults have different predators than the juveniles, you can set up different age structured classes. And I don't believe there's a limitation on the number of age classes that you can have in an EcoPath model for a particular population. The one consideration that you have to have there is that you are adding more parameters to your model. You're increasing its complexity. So generally, people only do that if they have a reason to justify it. Now, I would suggest that we always have a reason to justify that, but it's kind of dependent on the data you have. So the second question, we get a lot of our rates from literature, stock assessments, trait databases like FishBase is not the best source for us, but it's kind of what we're reliant on if we have no other literature-based information. And there's certain empirical methods to estimate things like mortality and consumption rates. Again, field data is better, but yeah.
One more specific question for Matt, and then we'll do the panel.
It's so good to see you're looking at individual-based modeling rather than averages and populations, et cetera, given that unless there was natural variability in populations, there'd be no evolution or speciation or anything. And I'm wondering about, with the model you're using, how much of this fuzziness or like ranges rather than average values can be incorporated into it?
Yeah, so for EcoPath in particular, and for most modeling frameworks, you can set it up to basically run Monte Carlo analyses. So you can put confidence intervals around each parameter, rerun it 1,000 times or whatever, and then you get a range of uncertainty in your model estimates once you do that. Yeah, that pretty much answers your question. But that is relying on you being able to also understand the confidence intervals around those parameters, which is, in my opinion, pretty lax in a lot of modeling efforts.
All right, well, let's give it up for Matt and then invite all of our speakers from today to join the panel.